called Linus, yeah. He had been our professor at the University of Queensland, and he left in the actually early 2000s to join, I think it was to join Chevron and then Oil Search. And he asked me to come back to PNG. He just called me up one day and said, I believe you grew up in New Guinea, you speak Pidgin, don't you? I said, no, I don't. I don't remember a word. And he said, well, look, I really need someone to go and do social mapping in the Gulf. He said, do you have a passport? I said, yes, I did. He said, I'll get you a visa. I need you in Moresby next week. And I had not planned to come back to PNG at all. Well, within a week I was back in Moresby, then 2 days later I was on a plane. The next morning I was on a plane to Udabu, and then the next morning after that I was on a chopper helicopter down to the Gulf. And within 3 days, sitting in a village, the Pidgin began to come back to me. I was beginning to remember things. And it was a funny feeling. I thought, my goodness me, why did I ever leave here? So, but I've been working with Exxon. I worked in Hella, Gulf, here in Moresby. My wife came back with me before I married her. She came back to PNG in 2010 and then left. I kept on coming back, working with Dr. Goldman and a few others, some of whom have actually died. The older ones who I work with and who Linus knows well, but mainly doing social mapping, social impact assessment, and in between doing my teaching on and off at University of Queensland. My last teaching job was, I was in Manus for about 4 years, doing some work there, and I left in 2017, said to my wife, look, that's it, I'm retired. I'm retired from PNG, and I got a job going. I got a job, I think, was at Griffith University teaching development for master's students. And then I was asked to come back to join K92 Mining, a very new, very small mining company from Canada that actually bought a mining lease in the mountains just, how can I put it, north of Kainantu, okay? I joined them and basically was told, right, well, you're General Manager, External Affairs and Sustainable Development. And I've written a textbook on it, on development for Griffith University students. They said to me, well, they said, basically it's an open book. It's an open book. You can just tell us what you want to do, and we will fund it. I had staff from all over PNG, very good staff actually. I did recruit Marcus Bayer, the rugby player. He's one of my senior officers. Many of you will know him, some of you probably don't, I don't know. But wherever Marcus goes, everybody wants his autograph. No one wants mine. No one wants mine. So, but no, I'm the only expat in the staff of 40. I've kept it like that because, and we do a lot of recruitment from the university in Ley, because they are the one, they're the institution that's very, very close to us, and that it's also set up for things like mining, and we do a lot of, I bring on a lot of students who do communication and development, and we recruit them. So I've been there for about 5 years, 1 more year, and then I am going to retire, as I've promised my wife. But who knows? Who knows? But looking at the whole issue of development, normally, of course, the whole issue comes up at election time here at PNG. Okay, people want to know from their local member, what have you done to bring development to our area? Okay, have you brought development? And if you haven't, what have you done? What have you actually brought? Of course, these are the physical things you can touch. Things you can actually touch: a bridge, a road, a clinic, a school, and so on. They're the things you can touch, but that's only a very small part, I would say, of what development actually is. If we go back into history and look at where the word actually came from, right? The word development basically originally was a word that French people used to use in the 17th century, okay? It came from a French word that meant, that actually was pronounced something like, and this is Old French, développer, which simply meant to unfurl and reveal things in nature, the things that God has actually made, revealing things that God has actually made. It literally means, if you look at the way it's spelled, it means to de-envelope. Okay? De-envelope. The envelope, open out. But of course, over the few hundred years, and I mean the 17th century in Europe was a very, very important time. There was a war that raged on throughout Europe for 30 years. And it was a war that killed millions of people, particularly in Germany, where my family originally came from. It killed millions of people, and it was a war over religion between Protestants and Catholics. Okay? But it was a very, very important time. Very, very important time. Because it was during that time that modern science was born. Modern science was born in that 100 years. So the word developer began to develop very much itself. While people were praising and revealing God's creation, scientists, they weren't called scientists back in those times, they were called natural philosophers. Okay? In Europe, they were called natural philosophers. But during that time, scientists, we'll call them scientists, were developing the scientific method, or the way to understand God's creation, nature, how it really is, how it really works and came about. The scientific method of systematic observation, measurement and understanding of nature allowed scientists during this time to increasingly use nature for people's benefit. This birth of science resulted in Europe's industrial basically ran for probably about 60, 70 years, from about 1760 through to about 1835, 1840. In these years, people began to particularly use things like steam and water power to build and use machines to make things in factories. Now, these things had previously only been made by hand in small villages across Europe and Britain. But because these powered factories were able to make more of these things faster, cheaper, and of course better, villages where people had lived for generations and actually worked with their hands to build these things, they went basically out of business. And people were pushed into cities to work in factories, or else they starved. If you've ever read any novels by Charles Dickens, you know Charles Dickens? Yeah? The novelist, Charles Dickens. Very, very famous novelist in the 19th century. I'm just trying to think what book he wrote. Oliver Twist, Great Expectations. If you've got them in the library interested in this period, which led to colonialism very much. Okay? It's worth your while getting some of these books, novels out to read them. Okay? With the need to move from their place, from their homes, from their villages, large families and clans in which they had lived broke down into what for many years in countries like Australia, the US, Britain and Germany were called nuclear urbanised families, which simply means mum, dad, 2 kids and a dog. Okay? Mum, dad, 2 kids and a dog. Urbanised families. Over this same 80 years during which production techniques were changed, simply were turned upside down, the word développer was slowly adopted into English as development. And by the late 18th century, the first part of this industrial change, this great industrial change, development meant something that gradually comes into existence or operation, simply appears. No explanation of how. The whole idea of God began to sort of slip a little bit. That wasn't the end of it. The more European scientists and manufacturers were able to build more efficient machines to help some people live more comfortable lives, the more resources European countries needed, more than they had actually at home. Already after 1492, Europeans had moved into other parts of the world, Africa, Asia, the Americas, and later, of course, here in the Pacific. And this was to make their lives as colonists. Okay? But in the late 18th century, part of this great industrial change, Europeans colonised Africa and Asia at an even higher pace to take more and more resources back to Europe to make things, and manufacture things. And in many cases, those things were sold back to the new colonies and the colonised people, whom the Europeans were trying to make into little European people so they could sell things back to them. Create markets as well as take resources. Okay? By the mid-19th century period, some 50 years later, the meaning of development changed to mean something that, in quotes, advances from one stage to the other toward a finished state, a completed state, a finished state. And what was that finished state? And it was actually, this is in the minds of European people, of course, they thought that they were the finished state. Okay? They and their way of living was the highest human level. And this finished state was something that everybody should copy. This meaning of development, Europeans, the most complete example of what all people should be, stayed with us from mid-19th century through the First World War until the very end of World War II. Now, World War II was very much here in PNG in Port Moresby. Yeah? Jackson's airport was built by the Australians originally as an air base to defend Port Moresby and the surrounding area. World War II, 1941 through 42, early 42. Okay, we very much had World War II here in PNG, every part of PNG. But that war was at first between the old 19th century industrially revolutionised countries of Britain, France, Germany and Japan, along with a highly industrialising USSR, right? Which is the old name for Russia. Not quite correct, Linus, is it? Russia was only one part of the USSR, okay? Then the USA, a new country. It actually began legally, I guess, or the British would say it did start legally, then, but 1776. The Americans did not believe in colonies. And of course it was a country that was very, very, very highly scientifically industrialised. It joined the war in late 1941. Of course the American Air Force turned up here in early 1942 at Jackson's. There was an Australian squadron of planes out here, and they only had about 2 or 3 planes left. Had 2 or 3 planes left of the whole squadron when the Americans turned up, and they had to learn to fly their own planes as well. Okay, but the Americans joined World War II, late 1941. They were very, very highly industrialised, probably the most scientific country on earth. And of course, using its scientific knowledge and skills, it applied Albert Einstein's very new, recent, that is 1905, understanding of power and energy to create the atomic bomb. And this bomb, of course, was dropped on Japan in 1945, which ended the war. And we're still, I guess, dealing with the legacy of that. But at the end of World War II, everything had changed. The war had forced the very old countries, Britain, France, Germany, Netherlands, Japan, to use up almost all or most of their resources. Many of their large colonies like India and Indonesia were demanding or fighting for independence. The USA, on the other hand, was the newly scientifically industrialised power. It was being challenged by heavily industrialising USSR for influence over these newly independent or independence-seeking colonies in Asia and Africa, as to which way would be the best to run their newly independent countries. Either a capitalist way, as promoted by the USA and the West, or a communist way, as promoted by USSR and China. Okay? Because China only became, wouldn't say communist or Marxist, they claimed they became Maoist in about 1949. Is that right? 1949? Basically, the nationalist Chinese were kicked out and moved across to Taiwan. Okay? So by about 1949, there were these two blocks. There was the American Western Bloc and the what they called the Eastern Bloc. Okay? This competition between communism and capitalism can be seen in the speech given by Harry Truman at his inauguration of the USA as the USA's 33rd president in 1949. Okay, we've got an election coming up in the US, well, it's on now, okay, but between the Republicans and the Democrats, there are others that run as well, but there are two people. In 1949, the Democrats won, and Harry Truman, who nobody thought would win, did. Okay? And of course, what the American president does, the new president does, is get up in front in Washington and deliver a speech. Truman talked in his speech of the need to develop. Now, this is 1949. If you read most of his speech, it was largely about development, because he saw that as a tool in the fight that basically the Americans in the West were having with USSR. Truman talked of the need to develop the majority of humankind who were, as Truman put it, impoverished, miserable, enslaved, hungry, unsheltered, and economically stagnant. It was important to develop or move these people into being industrialised, middle-class, urbanised nations, using Americans and the West's scientific knowledge. With this vision then, development came to mean not something that God does. Remember, the original meaning of the word means to reveal God's creation, okay? Not what God does, or that mysteriously pushes people to a more advanced state, but something that men and women consciously make happen. So it changed basically from being something that you don't do yourself, something that God does that you reveal to everybody else, to what you can do over that 300 or 400 years. 300 or 400 years, yeah. But by the late 1960s and into the mid-1970s, it became increasingly obvious that Truman's scientific industrialisation and urbanisation for all approach was not working. It was destructive and depleting people's natural resources and their environment. So by the mid-1980s, the United Nations created the idea of sustainable development, which means something like meeting current needs while not compromising resources for future generations, using less to preserve more. Besides, in spite of the promise of Truman's scientific industrialisation and urbanisation for all approach, much of the world's population remained poor. Much of the world's population remained poor, if not worse off. And this failure was due to not understanding that how people make their living is either tied directly to and or supported by how they live with each other. Large-scale scientific industrialisation only works efficiently where pay, for example, is based on performance, not on whom one is related to. A reward system based on performance is only possible where people are already urbanised into small, unrelated nuclear family units. Now that is actually an interesting point. That's something that I guess could be debated. Correct? Okay. It's something that we could debate. Further, Truman's scientific industrialisation and urbanisation will ignore the fact that over the past 70 to 100,000 years of human history, any community to have survived is the result of development, but in many different ways and forms. These many different forms of development, ways of life, are the result of journeys all of our forebears took out of what is now East Africa. Archaeologists and geneticists tell us this journey started between 70 and 80,000 years ago, and that is over 2,500, maybe 3,000 generations ago. Okay, if you trace your family tree back, okay, maybe 2,500, 3,000 generations. What scientists tell us is we all began in East Africa. Okay? Of course, this journey was over, many tens of thousands of years. Okay? It covered tens of thousands of miles and kilometres. The evidence is that they were pushed out of East Africa, we think, by scarcity of food, caused by one particular catastrophic event, or maybe it was climate change in some form. The journey out of East Africa to, for example, our own PNG here, was over many, many millennia. And the journey would have gone something like this, probably north to the Middle East, east to Asia, further on now to Southeast Asia, across the so-called land bridge to where we are now. It was a migration in the middle of an ice age in which the climate and environment were arid, cold, dangerous, as well as populated by other forms of humans. One particular group that's been found basically domiciled in East Asia in more recent years, called Denisovans. We don't know what they look like, but we know that they were a distinct genetic group in East Asia, and of course Neanderthals in Europe and West Asia. Now, many European people don't like to hear this, but it is a fact that probably between 2 and 6% of people, if you look at a person from Northern Europe, okay? Now, one thing I must tell you, in Australia, when you use the word European, I remember growing up here, and of course, people would call me a European. No, I'm not. I wasn't born in Europe. I've never been to Europe. I went, and my first wife actually was born in Europe, in Eastern Europe. And I remember when we were first together, keeping company with her. She's actually an anthro as well, anthropologist at the University of Melbourne. But her talking about, Europeans this, Europeans that. I said, what do you mean? People from Europe. So what it means in Australia is very different from what we used to, the way we used to use it there. Now, interesting thing is, I've got blue eyes. Okay? I've got blue eyes. Right? And that is a sign of me having some of the Neanderthal DNA within me. Okay? So most people from Northern Europe have actually got between 2 and 6% Neanderthal DNA. Okay? All right? But all those groups, except ourselves, Homo sapiens, that is all of us, all those groups have now gone. The most There was a group found some years ago in Indonesia, on the island of Flores, which is not far from us here actually. And the evidence was they were very small people, very small people. And they were living there probably up to 15,000 years ago. And that's very recent. But all those other human groups are now gone. And there are probably very good reasons for that, not good reasons, but only facts. Although it was an unfriendly world about which our forebears knew or understood little or nothing, they could not forever solve survival problems merely by avoiding and moving away from them, as they had done in the move north within Africa. At some point they had to engage with and strategise to protect themselves, and were enabled by the emergence of language. We all have language. We don't know when language emerged. Some, like Noam Chomsky, maintain it was a result of a genetic mutation that occurred about the time of the African emigration. Others, such as Daniel Everett's an SIL, Southern Institute of Linguistics missionary, who's become a very, very interesting anthropologist. He wrote a book called Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. He did his field work initially with a tribe in the Amazon, a group of people in the Amazon who had some very interesting features indeed. But he reckons that language is a cultural product that we develop over a long evolutionary time. Okay? Whereas Noam Chomsky, who's around still, maintains was simply what's called a genetic mutation. We developed, that human beings developed probably about 60, 70, 1,000 years ago. Just pure chance. I find that hard to believe, but Chomsky's been a very influential linguist and philosopher since what, 1958. And he has a lot of power. Noam Chomsky has a lot of power. He's actually tried to destroy Dan Everett's career. He has tried to destroy Dan Everett's career. I actually know Dan Everett. He's a nice guy. He's in the US. I don't know Noam Chomsky, although he used to come to Australia a lot. Regardless, we know we now have. We actually now have language. I don't care when it started, quite frankly. We have it, and it gives the ability to create shared sets of sounds that symbolise important aspects of the places in which we live, the environments we share. And this enables us to coordinate mutually supported action. Language not only enables shared descriptions of the present, but enables us to think, express and share the past and the future with each other, a bridge to passing accumulated knowledge and images of how the world could be on to the next generation, onto your children, and your parents have passed it on to you. Okay? The idea about the way things should be, all in language. But also in stories, which is language, proverbs, songs, dances, art, whatever. Okay? And these things are very, very important when you don't have written language. Okay? Songs, stories, because that stories are a very, very important way to actually wrap up all the information we need to have, okay, to remember it. It's much easier to remember a song than to memorise a list. Isn't that right? Much easier to remember a song or a poem or a story. Okay? That encapsulates the information we need often to live, to pass on to your kids, and of course your parents passed on to you, when you don't have a written language. That language exchange of symbols, whether it be spoken or when you've got written language, enables people to align their images as to what is and can be, and then follow up with actions. And this opens the way for the extension of kinship to those who are not physically of you or of others of whom you physically are. In other words, blood. Kinship enables us to extend relationship to people to whom we're not connected by blood.
The imagining of institutionalised relationships is a means to order and cooperation. I'm assuming you actually do cover PG in anthropology. I mean, look, I've actually been in the bush in PNG and asked people who live in the village, can you please, I said, look, I'm here to do, translate Pigeon family tree, and the next day I'll come back and they will have done it on a piece of paper, much better than any first or second year anthropology student can do it. Okay, so for you guys, kinship is something basically that you're in, right? That you're actually surrounded by. Okay. Sorry. The imagining of institutionalised relationships is a means to order and cooperation, and this is usually, of course, in the form of a clan. Now, you'll find that clans are almost a natural social formation. They're found throughout the world. Of course, some of the prime characteristics of clans, as I've found here, certainly here in PNG when I've been reporting them, is an ancestor, an apical ancestor, which is a Tumuna man or Bubu, a Tumuna story, origin story, common land, tamu something, in other words, totem, coat of arms. I've been in places in Western Province and asked them, where did you come from? And they told me they came from under a rock, but that rock we can't touch. Okay? The Mars people, I found many of the clans in one or two of the villages I did a lot of work in. Of course, their clan centres are fish. And those fish they can't catch. They're not allowed to catch them and eat them. If they do, they throw it back in the water. If another clan catches their fish, they have to come along and tell them that they've caught it. Do you mind if I have kai? Okay. But it'd be interesting to know, do you guys know what your mums and dads' clans, what symbols, what things they have that are tumble, something? You understand what I'm talking about? Yeah, that's right. My mother-in-law's clan in New Ireland is Kokomo, okay, the bird, the hornbill. And of course, there's usually a rule against marriage within the clan, and frequently another rule as to which clan you can marry from or should marry from, which I think Claude Levi-Strauss referred to as a positive marriage rule. Okay, saying who you must marry from, not just who you can't marry to, but who you must marry from. But within these near universal characteristics, clans take many forms within and between themselves. This is the world over. For example, in Fijian villages, clans provide a village's division of labour into 4 groups. Right? Traditionally in a Fijian village there are 4 clans, or 4 sets of clans. Right? There is one particular clan called, which in English is translated as a herald. They're the people, they're the clan that speaks for the chief. Fiji genuinely has a chiefly system. We don't necessarily accept your place as a chiefly system, doesn't it? Yeah, that's right, tribes. Okay? Much of PNG we don't necessarily have a chiefly system. We have elders and so on. But there are some places where the title is handed on. I know, but it's more than just that as well. It's actually often you find in Fijian villages, the chief will actually tell clans what they have to plant this particular year or this particular season. And of course, when everything is brought back from the garden, it comes to the chief, and the chief gives out the food. He actually rations the food out to whomever he wants. Okay? But normally in a Fijian village, you've got a particular clan that actually speaks for the chief, because the chief generally in Fiji and Polynesia as well, he doesn't speak. I've been in a village over there in Fiji where I was brought in as the guest of honour, and a whole lot of men was there, and they very quietly, sheepishly pointed out to their paramount chief, who was right at the back, basically hiding. It was regarded as rude for him to be up front. Okay? So the chief officer in the Fiji village doesn't say much, right? He tells others what to say for him. In that particular clan are called the Heralds, or the Matanaifa Vanua. And then there's a warrior clan to defend the village. Then you've got two clans, usually if the village is by the coast, you've got a land clan and a sea clan. Those are the people who catch the fish and grow the gardens. These complex systems of obligation and other forms of relating our forebears developed and bequeathed to us are a very complex form of technology. And I mean technology. Like a bridge, car, computer, aircraft, kinship is a creation of many human minds that enables us to survive and live better than we otherwise could. Some years ago, I was doing genealogies of Manus, and I was identifying this particular system's reference and address terms, along with its technonyms, and of course the marriage rule. In this particular village, they used to say, if someone wanted to marry somebody else, has this clan been gone 6 generations or more? Has anybody in the past 6 generations from our 2 clans married each other? The marriage rule is very strict. If they have, no marriage. Now, sometimes it is actually broken, and the way that's policed is very interesting. Okay, I was actually doing this research, and I was particularly looking at joking and avoidance rules. It was very interesting. Now, it just so happened that my prime village sponsor was a retired medical practitioner who actually had a medical practice near here, actually, one time, near the campus. And when he looked at my great big sheets of paper, he said to me, "Oh my God," he said, "I've never realised how complex my own system is." He said, "I've never realised how difficult it actually is." How did we actually do this? And I said, "Well, probably simply by trial and error." And I was actually talking about this with Linus before. There are mathematicians who actually spend a lot of their time trying to work out the patterns within, or the rules within kinship systems. They're so complex. Okay? Material assets can be lost in an instant, thus are not developed. It is instead how well people cope with and survive the conditions in which they find themselves. And our forebears largely cope by living in their environment, developing a social and symbolic organisational technology, knowing and valuing each other to survive and also thrive. But, according to a very recent study, the rejection of this relationship technology, kinship, in Europe by the Church from about the 4th century AD, is what opened the door to the industrial and colonial oddball that the West became and is. And it is an oddball. Okay? A Harvard anthropologist by the name of Joe Henry points to the Church's slow and increasingly strict ban on what he calls cousin marriage from the 4th century. Of course, by that he means anybody nearby, blood relative or not. And he reckons this was a catalyst of loosening local bonds and sending merchants, craftsmen and so many other professions to far-flung parts of Christendom, far away from any possibility of breaking the kinship-based marriage ban. Innovation theorists know that when you get people from many different backgrounds in one place and you can avoid conflict, you foster adaptation, innovation, new ideas and wealth. And this, argues Joe Henry, with supporting historical and current stats, is what opened the door to Europe's wealth, and with the Reformation, laid a basis also for the even more extreme version of a kenless life of hard work, which one particular writer, Max Weber, argued was a means to God's salvation. And by the 17th century, the development of science, the parent of technology, which enables great upmorphing of nature and production of things. As previously summarised, the West's devising ways to create things to provide a more de-risked and enjoyable life for itself pushed it to seek resources in other parts of the world. We've just talked about that. Parts of the world that did not understand the West's intentions or were unable to resist the West's direct and indirect threats. And the taking of resources from colonies opened the way for them to also become markets, right? Talked about that. We said, of course, with World War II, which some historians now see as the final using up of the Industrial Revolution's stocks of its capitals, the USA and the USSR, both allegedly anti-colonial, emerged as the dominant competing colonial powers, right? We just talked about this. There's a lot of them going to something else. Their competition for the hearts and minds of the many newly emerging independent nations was through their use of proxy wars and also under the veil of development. With the end of the Soviet bloc in 1989, this phase had long gone if it hadn't been already. Okay, the Berlin Wall came down. Okay, right, the Berlin Wall came, which was marked the end basically of the communist experiment, although some people tried to revive it. In 2024, today, unless you belong to a religious organisation and thus protected with a veil of sainthood, when doing development, it's very easy to be labelled colonial, post-colonial, neo-colonial, paternalistic, maternalistic, and so on. In fact, I've only been called neo-colonial publicly in the last 2 or 3 days by a friend. Okay, so I've been called that just recently.
What did you call it?
Colonial. Yeah. To avoid such accusations, you're often reduced to doing sustainable things, which what strategic planners call either tactics or priority projects, or concrete inputs to morph into outputs such as water pipes, schools, roads, bridges, clinics and farms. The list can go on, and pairing of inputs to put out all manner of usable things out in the communities for their use. And apart from its protective coating, reducing development to inputs for outputs is natural. Acting on material things that you shape into an output makes projects understandable, doable, deliverable, thus the lives of practitioners much easier. They're all concrete things we can largely control because we can touch them, feel them, smell, hear and see them. Furthermore, the word development, apart from its history that I referred to previously, represents a process, a chain of actions that are meant to build on and add value to each other, to an ending, a touchable, smellable, tasteable, hearable, seeable output. But all of this activity to see a landscape change in some way, while it can leave you with a feeling of having arrived at the end of a project, this can be a real trap. An activity chain can lock us into thinking we've delivered development, thus we can walk away. But we've merely delivered some hardware. While development is about people, the hardware for people for them to use to de-risk their lives in some way. Now, if we're going to focus on the very end of this input-output chain, the outcoming, to get out of the endless circle of thinking in terms of doing development, we can't just talk about development, we really must talk about a developed outcome. What the end of all that development, inputting and outputting is meant to look like. What a developed P&G would, should or could look like after all the inputs have been delivered. This gives us somewhere to go as well as a means to adjust what we're doing, our inputs and outputs, to make sure we get there as well as telling us when we do. But the question of what a developed P&G would, should or could look like begs such political and cultural and religious controversy that we may never get to an answer or consensus over. Okay? And of course, it's not up to me to tell you what it should look like. I'm a foreigner. Okay? But to ensure you get right what is right for you, could we not agree the prime desire and instinct of any human group, individual group, who care for each other is, as did our forebears in their journeys, de-risk living to the highest possible we can. So to agree on generic outcomes, such as ensuring citizens' highest possible quantity of life, life expectancy, along with the highest possible quality of life. The quality of life in PNG, or of lives in PNG, that is life expectancy, average number of years of birth, is currently just over 65, okay? For men, 63, and for women, 69.5, okay? This is 5 years less than our Melanesian brothers and sisters in the Solomons, 69 for men and 72.6 for women, and Vanuatu as well, very similar to the Solomons. Thus, the answer to increasing the number of years our citizens live seems not to be in what is now being done, or solely now being done. Further, the answer may not be in what Westerners are doing, nor in what people in Vanuatu are doing. The answer to PNG's greater life expectancy may lie elsewhere completely. Maybe a series of answers, maybe a very simple answer, or may take some time to develop, but any answer is best sought out of beginning with the end in mind. Beginning with the end in mind, basically finding where you want to be at the end of it. The current life expectancy plus n extra years of life, and then working back, reverse engineering by identifying the barriers, what other successful nations may have done in the past, right? In the distant past and of course the more recent past. But to get to desirable outcomes requires more than dumping the right assets into communities. Outcomes are things we can't control, and this is reflected in the old saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Okay? So how they respond to the hardware and whether it results in an increase in something in their lives is the very point of development. In other words, we really have to be totally conscious of the outcome. But outcomes are out of our hands, in the hands of people for whom we output assets in the first place. People can respond, express their outcomes in any number of ways. They can, as I've found, turn a new piece of hardware into a possession contest between clans who have been rivals for generations, whether it be a bridge, piece of road, packet of work, and this only being the most recent way to fight. Okay? A new asset can be used for something totally different from what it was intended. We usually find that when we refurbish a building or whatever, it then becomes a photo of who's to live in it, not who will actually provide the health service. A community can be completely bemused at the use of a new asset completely. This is very rare, and if it does happen, it reflects a company's lack of consultation with the community in the first place. So that's very bad development practice anyway. The community can also reject a proposed solution to a problem. It has, because it doesn't look like, according to them, it doesn't look like development. I asked a hydro engineer who has been working for me for 5 years, this chap, he's from Madanga originally, and he's brilliant at coming up with very simple solutions. I asked him to go and make sure it's a solution, a water provision solution that the people can actually maintain themselves. Otherwise, it's no good. Okay? One particular time he did, he came back and he said, "Mark, I think the solution to this village's problem, the simple solution, one they can deal with, is simply tanks, water tanks. Yeah? We put a series of them right in the middle of the village, instead of what they were wanting." He went back and proposed it to them, and they rejected it flatly. Why? Because to them it did not look like development. Now, thank you. Now, the solution they wanted was actually to run a pipe by 1.5 kilometres down to the village. In the end, the water source they wouldn't let us use because it was a sacred water source. So I don't think the village still has water. Okay. Because it didn't look like develop. Okay? Fair enough. And of course, we can find often, as they will do where I am, behave in a way that is congruent with what the hardware was designed for. And you know, I'm glad to say in one particular village we've actually maintained a clinic that Barrack mine originally built many years ago. I have a nurse on my staff who stays in the village full time and basically provides basic medical care. Of course, it's used by the people. Increasing the quantity of life expectancy will certainly need more than governments, churches or resource companies like my own to provide and do things to enforce citizens. And this is the very point about outcomes that are meant to flow from all the inputs, expenditure and effort that are shaped into outputs. For health intended outputs to result in the outcome of increased life expectancy, citizens have to respond to those outputs by attending clinics that are fighting over who it belongs to or who's going to limit it, following the advice of health education dietitians, reducing harmful food intake levels, and recognise and claim infections when they occur instead of ignoring them. In other words, citizens have to do their part, do the right thing for themselves. Given the isolation of so much of PNG's population, they're doing the right things for themselves requires the right education and messaging. Efficient means to messaging as well as a population that's more literate than it now is. Currently, PNG's literacy rate is a mere 63%. It's one of the reasons my own company, my own team actually has a particular focus on teaching people in the villages to read and write. Because where I am in the Eastern Highlands, I'd say that the literacy rate probably might be about 25–30%, if that. So I employ, I'll put on a second teacher very soon, some women to go out and actually live and work in the villages. In the last couple of years, we've actually had 602 village people go through our classes. And many of them, because of this, have actually been able to get jobs because they can speak English better, they can write a letter, and so on. Basic things like this. Okay? Kano too, as well, this is my own company. We actually do a lot of health work as well, going out particularly informing women about what their rights are in villages, and the men have now begun to come along as well, because I think they genuinely want to know themselves, but particularly the women. They're often the ones left at home, and we actually combine with the police domestic violence unit, usually, and spend a whole week going around the villages and talking about health, sexually transmitted diseases and anything basically that's current. But of course, then there's that hoary old thing, quality of life. This is so subjective, personal, that we shouldn't be able to really measure it, but I think there's probably more consensus as to what quality of life is than we might think. Certainly here. I did a very quick and ready survey not long ago of some of the team at the mining company, and basically indicate that PNG people see quality of life as an internal state of feeling, that they want to have. Or, if they're fortunate enough, already have. The survey told us that our people want to feel satisfied, happy and content even with their lives. They identified the roads to dissatisfaction, happiness, contentment as having, for example, their own intact housing, unthreatened by tribal fighting. One of my officers lost his house up in Enga not long ago. Housing with their families, safely and securely in it, with enough good, nutritious food to eat, effective health care and meaningful education available for them and their children. This extends into the opportunity for them to develop into more knowledgeable adults who are respected by and respect others. Of course, this entails more confidence in the intentions, behaviour of others around them. In short, for this very quick and ready sample of staff, quality of life is measured by the level of comfort and confidence they have in their lives, which is determined in no small part by the good or bad intentions of others. In fact, that was one of the things that people continually mention. That the need for more confidence in the world around them, as commonly mentioned, indicates that the level of confidence and interpersonal trust is not high. While citizens' level of confidence in their daily lives is assisted by government, churches, NGOs, and of course resource companies like mine, their provision of inputs, whether expenditure, materials, knowledge, to output necessary assets, that is schools, farms, clinics, post-school education, law and order, and hardware and personnel. Citizens must choose to have confidence in others. In other words, it's obviously people.
For the next part, and you need to write up.
This
You need to write up.
This is expressed by expecting the best intentions behaved from others by giving them the best intentions behaved in the first place. Thus, the level of interpersonal trust and confidence needed to truly create and be a developed society is not only the product of churches, agencies, NGOs, government, companies, but it's the product of every citizen, one by one from the inside out. And how do we get to every citizen receiving confidence? Maybe with incessant messaging and more subtle nudging to influence citizens as to how they can best be with each other. This, of course, leads into another topic, in communication for development, which I can talk on another time, but not today. Okay. Very important. For me, communication is more important than the technical aspects of development. Technical things in development are not hard to solve, and solved simply, but it's communication. This is why I'm about ready to launch a radio station, FM radio station up where I am, 24 hour. Why we have a news magazine that I put out, which is a Core Development magazine, and a whole range of other things as well. Why we taught people to read, because I want people to actually take their lives into their own hands, where they can, basically do things, feel as though they can do things for themselves. Sorry, I didn't want to keep that. Didn't want to keep that. Thank you.